Hello and welcome to another episode of Smart Talk. I'm your host, Mansa, and today we're talking about Charlie Kirk. The assassination of Kirk is a huge, huge deal, and there's sure to be huge fallout from it. With me to talk about a communist perspective on the Kirk assassination, the reaction from the White House, and most importantly, to give some answers to some of Kirk's arguments that made campus liberals look totally lame and useless, are comrades from the US. I've got with me Michael Davisson, editor of Workers Vanguard, as well as Erica. Hi, comrades.
Hello, Mansa. Happy to be here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Of course, thanks for agreeing to sit in the hot seat. Okay, so listen, obviously massive deal. I'm not sure who hasn't heard, at least in the Western world, about who Charlie Kirk was, what happened with his assassination. But for anybody who's maybe not aware, could you just start by laying out who's Charlie Kirk and why is his assassination such a huge deal? Why has it led to such huge reactions from the White House and the right wing, basically?
Okay, Charlie Kirk was a young reactionary ideologue who kind of built his career debating liberals on the campus. And he basically built the campus arm of the MAGA movement in the form of his Turning Points USA organization, which is probably close to, if not the largest campus organization today, and is largely credited with having rallied and kind of channeled youth discontent with their increasingly bleak prospects for the future into support for right-wing reaction and Trump's agenda in particular. And in short, having delivered Trump the youth vote in the 2024 elections. He's also credited with having kind of identified J.D. Vance as kind of the as vice presidential material and thus kind of the close connection between Vance and Kirk himself. So he was a very strong ally and major player in the MAGA movement.
Yeah. So, I mean, there were a lot of people who called Charlie Kirk a fascist. Would you say that that's wrong then?
Absolutely, because, a fascist is kind of, the shock troops of reaction who are there to, for lynch mobs against Black people, immigrants, the left, to physically break up working class organizations. And that wasn't what Kirk's activity was about. So, and even on the ideological level, because like I said, Turning Point USA, largest campus organization in this country, if that were true, then the campuses would be like a hornet's nest and organizing centers of lynch mobs and these kind of physical provocations against workers organizations and whatnot. And that's just not the reality, of course. And the other side of it too is that the liberals and left, many leftists like to say, well, he was basically the equivalent of a Joseph Goebbels. He was the Nazi propaganda minister. But even there's kind of a disconnect because Nazi propaganda ministers push explicitly the inferiority of Jews and racial minorities and their physical extermination, and there's a certain line there, and Kirk would kind of know that line and go up to it and poke at it with the liberals, but that's not what he was explicitly arguing, advocating. So this was basically a way for the liberals and the left to avoid actually making arguments to expose Kirk's ideas, because what Kirk was trying to do was channel, like I mentioned, the discontent in society among white workers, among youth, and into a reactionary direction. And so instead of making arguments that would actually expose and counter that and show white workers, youth, that actually the way forward was not the direction that Kirk was pointing, but in a totally different direction, they were basically allowing his ideas to take hold among youth, right?
Uh-huh.
So calling him a fascist not only was not accurate in terms of what the role he played in society and his actual activity, but also was counterproductive from the standpoint of politically defeating the actual reactionary trend that he represented in society.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to add that, many people have watched his YouTube videos now and, and see him, debating these liberal kids, many of them, Black students, etc. If he was a fascist, you know, those kids, wouldn't be standing there like that. They would be, really physically threatened. And, that's not what Turning Point USA meetings were or what he was, in fact. And also by just branding him, a fascist, as Michael was saying, did nothing to politically defeat his arguments or his politics, which are have resonance in the working class. And, by just, seeking to silence him and to, just discard his politics as, fascist. So, we have, nothing to answer here, actually leaves working class people who are attracted by his arguments, where he talks about giving job vacancies or campus slots to minorities over white people, or, his anti-trans rhetoric, and claiming that, immigrants, are criminals who are taking the jobs away from the workers, have found resonance in the working class. And by not politically defeating, those arguments, you just leave a wing of the working class in the arms of, reactionaries like him. And, with his death, that has only intensified.
Yeah. There's lots in what you said there, but since you've just ended with that, what has happened since his assassination? I mean, it's something that J.D. Vance was one of the pallbearers for his coffin, right? Trump and the others, they headlined at his memorial. As you said, he was a key pillar of the MAGA movement. And now Trump is pretty clear that there's going to be some consequences. But I feel like my reading of it, obviously this is from afar, my reading of it is that that's not really quite dawned on a lot of the liberals on the left. Maybe I'm wrong, but could you maybe just explain a little bit of the reaction to this assassination from the right and the halls of power, and what kind of fallout we could expect?
Yeah, in the initial hours in which the video of the assassination and news circulated on social media, there was quite a bit of celebration in liberal left quarters, and this was exceptionally dim on a number of levels, but first and foremost, not understanding that this killing would be seized upon to launch a massive crackdown on liberal organizations and the left, broadly speaking. And that, in fact, is exactly what has been building in the days since the assassination. So Trump, very early on, promised vengeance, against the radical left. That carried through to his speech at the memorial this past weekend, where he repeated that Charlie Kirk is a martyr and that promised, full-scale retribution against his political opponents, which yesterday kind of got codified in its initial form in an executive order that designates Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. And of course, there's no organization in the United States known as Antifa. It's kind of a broad ideological, it's a just a shorthand for anti-fascism, and in particular associated with kind of black bloc anarchist types, but applicable to any organization that is, deemed anti-fascist. And of course, from the standpoint of the White House, that's everyone calling Charlie Kirk a fascist, and everyone, all his political opponents, every left organization, anarchist, Marxist, liberal alike, is kind of now really in the crosshairs, and Trump is promising to kind of throw the full resources of probably the most powerful capitalist state on the planet, this ruling class of state, behind this crackdown. And this is going to involve like financial investigations and using kind of donations and funding of certain protest activity as a pretext to kind of participation in those protests. One area where Trump is very explicit is a protest that this designation is going to be used to basically make illegal anyone who goes out and tries to in any way hinder ICE from carrying out the anti-immigrant roundups. So it's really, this really promises to be not good. The other way why celebrating wasn't dim is, and kind of the logic is, even if for those who didn't think he was a fascist per se, was that, well, he purveyed hate speech, he hate speech. And so now there's one less major voice purveying hate speech. But the problem is that his assassination has actually kind of solidified support for the very ideas he was saying. Because basically, a lot of people got drawn to him because of, what's happened in the past years under liberal rule, where in the name of kind of high-minded principles, liberal politicians, mostly centered in the Democratic Party, have economically pounded and squeezed workers, white and black, immigrant alike in this country, while kind of using those high-sounding ideals to particularly kind of blame white workers for the ills of society. And you might recall, like in the 2016 election, the first election where Hillary Clinton referred to the kind of white working class base of support for Trump as deplorables, right? And so basically what you have this situation where these liberals were saying Kirk was a racist and deserved to die. Yay, he's dead. And white workers who had been told you're racist and this, and this society is going backwards and you should just kind of eat it so that, and kind of continue to suffer. By the liberals, but by these very same liberals, now are because of that, they, Kirk's ideas before his death had kind of had some currency, and now it's even more strongly the case because of that kind of same dynamic of saying racist and then in celebrating kind of that moral blaming. And so that kind of gets back to the not being able to politically answer Kirk and provide answers that would actually improve the situation for the working class, improve the situation for Black people, and so on.
Yeah, for sure. I think anybody listening could probably infer this, but I just want to cite from the leaflet that you guys just put out. It's called Kirk Still Needs to be Proved Wrong. It was put out on the 22nd of September. And in it, in the introductory paragraph, you say, quote, "We certainly will not mourn his absence, but he should not have been killed," end quote. Now, I think listeners can probably tell from how you just laid out the fallout and really the basis of support for Kirk and so on, that this was, it was really a result of not being able to confront him politically, that there was this sort of act of desperation, and the sort of liberal cheering on for his death comes from finally we got rid of that opponent who just, made us look stupid on campuses and so on. But I do want to just probe this question a little bit farther, because I know that one of the debates raging in some circles is whether or not his killer was a leftist, like a lone leftist, anechoic type, or whether he was in fact, part of the MAGA movement. And there's lots of debates and ink being spilled over this. I personally don't see I don't know what the point of that debate is. Maybe there is a point, but I wondered, what's your take on this, and does it matter? What would you say to our listeners?
I, don't know. There's a lot still we don't know about the guy, but who assassinated Kirk. But, we do know, from whatever perspective, he hated his politics and, and, just assassinating, ideologues is, it's very counterproductive in terms of actually, exposing and, answering, his, politics, which, many did find, repugnant for, many, various reasons, including us. We kind of said in our leaflet that his assassination was the logical extension of cancel culture, which seeks to just silence everyone, whose, views, aren't in sync with common liberal values and viewpoints. And so he should not have been killed. That's not the way to provide, an answer against the politics that so many, youth on the campuses and workers, found attractive. For that, you really, can't just, he's a racist, he should be silenced. I mean, what does that say to a lot of the working class has various, backward ideas in their head. And you're not going to be able to raise that kinds of consciousness just by completely, shutting off and not being able to provide real answers for what kind of fuels those types of more conservative viewpoints.
Yeah. It's just be really clear. Like the motives of the shooter, or the guy accused of shooting him right now. It's really immaterial to anything that Erica or I have said up to this point, which is really about the political significance of this assassination and how it's going to be used, irrespective of the motives of the shooter. Trump administration is going to goes full steam ahead against the left. And the liberal left is in a completely desperate position and has no real answers to Kirk. And that's really kind of the real significance of what's been revealed by this assassination.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I just want to say, before we get into a more substantive discussion on answering Kirk, I really appreciate the approach you guys took, which is, okay, this guy's been assassinated, but listen, guess what? The ideas that he was putting out there, they still exist. Nobody still is able to refute them. So, the problem isn't over. So we still need to answer these. And I think that's really valuable, both in terms of arming the left and those college campus kids who want to learn lessons, but also, also answering to those layers of the working class who do buy into some of this right-wing ideology on whether it's race, on the woman question, on immigration, etc. So kudos to you guys for still pursuing the answers despite Charlie Kirk no longer being. So the other thing I'll say is I never really watched Charlie Kirk videos, because why would you? Following this, got to doing this, and I have to say it was one of those things that you want to keep watching because it's so bad that you can't look away. I don't know if you share that view, but it's like you'd have these, like, it just took me back right to my universities. You'd have these nice young college kids who are like, they just kind of go hysterical. And you'd be like, what's a woman? And I'm like, whatever somebody thinks they are. And then just like meltdown would happen. And it was so bad because they're really sticking to these tenets of like postmodern ideology that's taught in all these like social sciences and humanities courses, that when the minute they hit reality, they just poof and they have no legs to stand on. And it was really sad to watch how these young campus liberals would get continuously destroyed. I think the other thing that for me was really disturbing and enlightening to watch was the number of young people. As you said, Michael, that he really built MAGA on campuses, but there's so many of those videos where you would see young white women wearing MAGA hats, and that to me is saying a lot. I guess I didn't quite, not being from the country, I didn't really. It's one thing to know, okay, youth support Trump. It's another thing to watch it when there's like loads of white women, young white women, wearing MAGA hats, supporting Kirk. And then you realize, okay, well, these are really anti-women views and so on and so forth. Anyways, so I really look forward to getting into this discussion about answering Kirk. But you guys picked a number. So okay, for our listeners, the leaflet goes into a number of things that Charlie Kirk would say time and time again. You know, some of his main talking points, whether that's on DEI, on affirmative action, on crime and Black people, or I think one of the most sort of famous ones, maybe I'm wrong, is the woman question, on the trans question, right? What is a woman? So you guys pick some of these, and what you've done is sought to sort of present what Charlie Kirk was saying and then counterpose a Marxist, a working class answer to really be able to actually take on what he was saying and expose it. Maybe we can just go turn by turn. You guys start by talking about what Kirk said on Black women in high places, right? Affirmative action. Maybe you could just give a bit of a context. There is a quote that you cite here from one of his podcasts, or you know, maybe you could just start by laying out what was this issue and how do you answer it?
Okay, well, the particular quote we start from is one that is actually been at the center of the debate over kind of what he stood for in his legacy, which is, you know, the quote about four particular Black women who benefited from, you know, affirmative action and therefore, to him, you know, demonstrated that they lacked the brain processing power.
They just weren't for any particular Black women. They were
right. That's
Democratic
true.
Party.
Yeah. Actually, let me just read this quote out.
Operative.
Yeah, I'm just going to read this quote out because I think it's worth it. So this is from the Charlie Kirk podcast from the 13th of July, 2024. And he says, quote, "If we would have said that Joy Reid and Michelle Obama and Sheila Jackson Lee and Ketanji Brown Jackson were affirmative action picks, we would have been called racist. But now they're coming out and they're saying it for us. They're saying, I'm only here because of affirmative action. Yeah, we know. You don't have the brain processing power to otherwise be taken really seriously. You had to go steal a white person's slot." God, saying it out loud, it's quite gross.
Yes.
So break it down for me. How do you answer this to a person who's really ticked off with the affirmative action and the whole notion that, you know, the minorities are taking their jobs?
So this is, you know, you can point to on, you know, kind of the obvious assumption that's kind of baked into the quote, which is that, you know, is kind of the norm is that you earn entrance to university or gain a job offer based on merit alone, right? And of course, you know, connections, nepotism, wealth, and all of that are really kind of the driving, are often the kind of the driving factors, especially in high profile jobs or elite universities, right? And there's plenty of white people who are in positions that they didn't earn, as well as the fact that on both sides of the kind of the political aisle or justices and judges with different political bents, that they, you know, they're not exactly, you know, geniuses, right? But that's really, you know, and that's just kind of a basic recognition of kind of what you know, what is, and just that assumption he's playing on. But there's more, there's a lot more to it, because what's, you know, the fundamental, he's really playing to kind of a swindle kind of that's kind of central to affirmative action, which is that in a society where there's a fixed number of such job openings or a fixed number of university positions at the university, if you set one aside or for a Black person or give preference to a candidate who is Black, then that necessarily means that there will be one less position for a white person or some other non-Black person, or you disadvantage a white person or other non-Black person for that job or position at the university. And so that, particularly when opportunities, start to contract, becomes a real sort, that kind of built-in tension just really explodes. It becomes, a source of friction, just becomes one that really boils over. And what you can say, and so what he's there to do is to kind of take the kind of discontent, which is going to be that discontent that will be generated from affirmative action, and kind of lead it in a direction that not only will kind of reinforce the oppression of Black people, but also will make it impossible for white workers and white youth to fundamentally improve their situations as well, because it blames Black people for their conditions, and in the process will hold back those, like I said, white workers and youth, because it distracts from the fact that the the people who are holding back the opportunities for white workers and who are economically squeezing white workers and making things difficult for white youth are the same people who are, forcibly segregating Black people in the ghettos there in the inner city under the worst conditions. And that's the ruling class that actually calls the shots in society. So so fundamentally, that's the problem, that the liberals, through their affirmative action scheme, in the name of righting, historic wrongs, are not actually are doing something which actually can't do that, because it's at best opening a few positions for kind of better off layers of the Black population to gain access, to in society, without doing anything to touch the underlying kind of oppression of the Black population. And it's reinforcing that division between different sections of the working class, between the Black working class and the white working class. And Kirk is there basically to fuel the same thing, to reinforce that division and take it in a different direction, a reactionary direction. So that's really kind of the dynamic at work here. And
a lot of those DEI, programs were implemented, a number of them, during the Biden years. The liberal world order was really crumbling, and they were kind of like last ditch, attempts to place the blame of the sinking economy and the shrinking of the job pools and et cetera, on a layer of the working class, and to divide the class. And it did really exactly just that. A number of workers who, had to sit through those, DEI, programs, which essentially, sought to, blame the white working class, for racial oppression. And they were just supposed to kind of suck it up and, be told that, hey, well, now you have to give, opportunities that are, very far and few in between to, racial minority that you have, quote unquote, historically wronged. So he was, by a kind of targeting, I think what Michael called the kind of swindle of DEI, he was really, tapping into layers of the working class, particularly the white working class, who, are kind of fed up of being blamed, for racial oppression. And he, was able to kind of, I guess, widen those, polarizations.
Yeah.
In response to the liberal DEI and affirmative action programs that were in large part aimed to benefit, exactly those women that, he named, like, Michelle Obama or, Ketanji Brown Jackson, et cetera, played a prominent role for the ruling class, particularly the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
Who has been responsible for keeping the population down and in a dire state, and in particular, the irony of it, the Black population
Exactly.
in the U.S.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, these are not just any sort of Black women who got promoted. These are some of the most wretched,
Yeah. Well, we say it's not exactly the greatest success, story to go on about,
For sure,
what
for
their
sure.
role is. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think on the DEI question, it's I've heard often stories of like perfectly nice, like white men who are being forced to sit through like gender sensitivity training and like racial whatever, how to get rid of your white privilege, quote unquote. And it's just it's like it makes me feel really uncomfortable and horrible because like these are perfectly nice people. What the hell? Why are they being made to like sit through like, a session of like, hey, you should feel guilty because you're not a woman and you're not an oppressed minority. So, repent by listening to a liberal talk about nonsense. But anyways, I always get really not always just going.
Yeah.
Coming
But what
sorry, go on. Yeah, go on.
yeah, I was just gonna say, but what in fact, like makes, Kirk's comments particularly gross is actually his, denial of, the fact that, Black people in this country have been held back by racial oppression,
Exactly.
and are still held
yeah,
back by racial oppression. I mean, he likes to pretend everything is done and dusted, and it's just simply Black people's fault that they don't do better, which of course is complete rubbish. But that's what he represents. So.
yeah. And we also make the point that has a convergence to some of what he says, like the kind of pull your, what Black fathers need to, act like men and do better, whatever. I mean, Obama used to echo the same lectures, to the conservative sort of family value shit, it plays out, I think, in terms of regimenting and blaming the Black population, on both sides of the political spectrum, in fact.
Yeah, actually, that's quite useful that you mentioned that the Black population really got this moral blackmail from both sides. The liberal Democrats, the Black president in the White House, as well as a white reactionary in MAGA.
And Kirk was actually pointed this out that, actually Obama said the same thing at times. And so he himself was well aware. And both the post-racial and the family values, et cetera. And so he played to that, as well.
It also really shows you how Kirk was quite successful in putting the liberal viewpoint in a bind and frustrating them because he's attacking them, on the basis of what they've been saying, but they're, the truth is kind of there for everybody to see. That the working class is increasingly repelled by this. So I think this sort of transitions us quite nicely into the next point, which is very provocative on the part of Kirk. And this is where he's talking about Jim Crow and the state of Black people in the United States today. So the second point that you try and provide answers to is the following. And I'll again just read out the quote because I think it's worth saying. So this is from September 2024, a year ago. Charlie Kirk said, quote, "There was evil. Jim Crow was terrible. But Black Americans are poorer today in 2024 than they were in the 1950s." End quote. Now, I think just to a listener, to a non-American listener, that sounds quite crazy because everybody, Jim Crow was what it was, it was terrible. But he's making this really provocative statement that actually the conditions of Black Americans today, more than half a century later, is worse. Now, I don't know if there's truth to this. I don't know what's the basis of him making these statements, but this also was one of the really polarizing sort of strands of argumentation that he would get into. So why don't you guys maybe lay out what this one is about?
Yeah, in terms of the truthfulness of the statement, I mean, Kirk, he obviously had mastered certain techniques, and one was to take an element of truth and kind of exaggerate and stretch it out for his political objectives. So if one just looks at it, in terms of kind of absolute wealth of the Black community in the 1940s or 50s versus today, even adjusted for inflation, Black people are on the whole not poorer today than they were then. But what is true is that the wealth gap between Black and white has been unchanged over that period of time. And if you just look out, and if you just look around in this country today, everyone can see that Black people, the vast bulk of Black people still live in intolerable conditions and of kind of grinding, dire poverty. So he's really, this is a real frontal challenge to in particular, the liberal-led civil rights movement and kind of the view among liberals that it fundamentally improved the conditions of Black people in U.S. society. If you actually look at, the kind of fundamental conditions of life, whether it's jobs or housing or education, Black people still have health care. Black people still have the worst of it today. There's kind of a reason for that, which neither Kirk will speak to, of course, but the liberals, the reason liberals can't answer, which is that the liberal-led civil rights movement did obviously succeed in the dismantling of Jim Crow, the kind of legal code that had separate bathrooms, drinking fountains, and so on for Black people and white people. But that was just one mechanism for racial segregation in U.S. society. And the liberal civil rights movement kind of ran into that in a very real way when the struggle shifted from the South to the North and basically ran up against the wall of kind of the segregation being the residential segregation, the segregation in all those areas I just mentioned. But there was actually the entire way the society is organized is to enforce the Black people on the bottom of society. And so Tyranny really fundamentally changed the segregated status of the Black population requires changing that social organization and the actual material roots of segregation. And the liberals, for the liberals, social problems are fundamentally moral in nature. And so they can't possibly kind of square that material reality with their kind of conception that the oppression of Black people is simply kind of the persistence of bad ideas in people's heads, right?
Yeah, and the Civil Rights, Act and the Civil Rights Movement, I mean, it went as far as the ruling class was willing to let it. And, they were willing to let go of legal Jim Crow segregation, but, were able to, importantly, for them, meaning the ruling class, maintain, the segregation, of Black people, and whether that's, neighborhoods, housing, workplaces, et cetera, in order to, keep the conditions for the working class, as a whole down. The Civil Rights, Act that, he was going on, hasn't done anything, for Black people. Or hasn't improved their, situation, as Kirk, was has said. There's truth in that, in terms of it not being able to, address the fundamental, segregated conditions of the Black population in the U.S. and kind of, materially, um, uh, increase their kind of, standard of livings and their daily confrontations with racial oppression and state terror did nothing to, improve that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, as you're saying that, I keep thinking that, wow, you don't touch the civil rights movement, like that is really a pillar of the movement for the rights of Black people in the United States. It was a huge deal. And I think unless it's like in like far left corners, you don't really hear a criticism of it.
Yeah, I was, exactly. I mean, part of, what held that movement back is in many ways what continues to hold the, struggle for Black equality back today. And that's, keeping that struggle bound to the same racist ruling class, even with, lipstick on and saying we love Black people like the Democrats do. But as long as you keep them,
Chained.
keep the struggle chained, to the same racist ruling class that's responsible for racial oppression and exploitation, the struggle is going to, be doomed. And that's really why it couldn't move forward.
Yeah. Just out of curiosity, what do you think a Black person would say about like the criticisms of the civil rights movement that you're saying? Do you think it would have any traction to them, or they would be incensed that you're criticizing, MLK and so on and so forth?
Well, I mean, I think, the reality of the situation, um, would be kind of hopefully staring him in the face when
Hard to
I'm
deny.
talking. In terms of, how have, the conditions, that Black people face on a daily basis, improved, since, the 1950s or et cetera. And I'm not, discounting the, the difference between, Jim Crow segregation and the, um, you know, atrocity that it was, or taking light of that. The, naked truth is that, in, every area, Black people, have not been able to, materially, advance their real struggle, for equality in this country. And I think, what I'm saying about the civil rights movement and why it was held back should be taken into consideration with those factors.
Yeah, for sure. I'm starting to see the theme emerge, so you had the liberal sort of response double down on the sort of existing course of DEI, defending the civil rights movement as it was, as is like achieved liberation for Black people. And then the right wing going on the offensive on these things. And then the liberals not being able to answer. One, because, as you said, Erica, I think the reality is kind of difficult to confront and deny. And you get this vicious cycle of like more hysterical argumentation, but which is really not productive and it goes nowhere. And what I think the biggest crime of this kind of polarization is that ultimately it's the working class who loses, and workers see this debate playing out and they're like, well, oh, the guy on the right wing, he's at least makes more sense than those other people, because at least he's touching on aspects that are hard to deny. I don't know, maybe I hope I'm not being too soft on the right wing, but you really start to see the polarization and how really to break through the two sides, you need a materialist approach. You need to start with where things are at, the interests of the ruling class, how they've advanced, what's the aims of the ruling class, etc. So I'm starting to see that emerge as we keep talking.
Yeah. And I think you have to link like what, has held back the Black struggle is very much linked to what has held back the struggle for the working class, in this country, as well. And, and that's kind of the misleadership of these movements who really sacrifice those struggles in the interest of the working class, to the interests of the bosses and the ruling class that's responsible for and the cause of the worsening conditions and racial oppression.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
they're tied.
Yeah. Speaking of worsening conditions and racial oppression, the other point that you guys try and untangle and answer is a question of crime, and crime specifically committed by Black people. So let's coming on to our third point. I'll again go through another quote by Charlie Kirk. So this is from, I guess again, it's from 2024. Quote is, Blacks commit more crimes than whites do. They commit more murders. They commit more arsons. They commit more kidnappings. That's not a war on drugs. That's a culture problem. Why are so many Blacks committing murders outside of their population? ? End quote. So again, massively inflammatory, but help us understand.
Yeah. So this is another case where Kirk is taking kind of one piece of truth, which is that at least in the recent years, Black people have committed more murders than whites, and kind of expanded that to crime as a whole, which is not the case. The white population is substantially larger than the Black population in the U.S. And in doing so, it's trying to play to kind of the stereotype of kind of the prowling, predatory Black person, which is kind of, one of the themes of reaction in this country, of course. The liberals, though, are kind of flip it around and just call him a racist and try to present some rival statistics, which don't really kind of, just dodge the whole question of the disproportionate share of crime committed by Black people, and basically or explicitly argue that raising the question of crime committed by Blacks inherently feeds into racism. And fundamentally, this is an expression of the inability of the liberals to offer any kind of answer other than kind of more of the same that has done nothing but create misery in the Black communities, like, kind of piecemeal social work programs or more cops who will always make any situation even worse than what it was. And so to really counter him, you have to deal with what the social reality is. And oftentimes the liberals who would try to actually counter him would just throw out, kind of vaguely, so that, there's bad they would say bad socioeconomic factors in the Black community, like poverty or poor schools, the things we've already talked about here. Which of course is true, but then he would turn that on them and say, wasn't that the case back in the 40s and 50s when, when Kirk claimed crime in the Black community was less, and that would just really stymie the liberals. They again wouldn't know. They wouldn't have an answer to that. And again, because for them, it's fundamentally about kind of the ideas in people's heads. But if you actually look at the kind of the context of where this country was, the kind of basically the state of the country in the immediate post-World War II period versus today, you kind of recognize that the society in the first instance was basically that this ruling class was at the height of its power in its domination of the globe. It emerged from the war not only victorious, but with its manufacturing base at its height, whereas its rivals had been completely decimated. So the U.S. kind of stood head and shoulder above its rivals. And kind of that was reflected in kind of a certain social surplus that the ruling class could afford to give to build up a social safety net and the availability of jobs in manufacturing and so on. And if you fast forward to today, U.S. imperialism, this ruling class has seen its position on the world stage slipping, and it's very kind of desperately scrambling to shore that up. And that social surplus is by and large gone at this stage, and so that social safety net has been whacked back. The jobs that are available tend to be poor wages, poor conditions, completely insufficient to really meet the basic necessities of life. So there's kind of and that situation. I would just add that the present situation has been fueled by or has been created by liberals and liberalism, which has been kind of the dominant ideology and kind of the dominant trend of the ruling class in recent decades. So so that's of course one side of it, and Erica will speak to this.
Well, I mean, I think the kind of the liberal response to him is, again, sort of bends over backwards in a sense to kind of deny the reality of crime in Black neighborhoods, that people who live in those neighborhoods, exist and kind of deal with on a daily basis. For most Black people living in poor, impoverished neighborhoods, priority on their mind is to get out of that situation and to, want better. Kind of the liberal answer, of, just, it to admit this, kind of to admit, there's a problem with, whatever it's, crime in the Black communities or, on the subways or, just the statistic, that's quoted that, Black people have murders, et cetera, does, nothing to kind of redress the situation.
Yeah.
And to kind of, um, prepare both Black people and the working class for what's really kind of necessary to do to kind of improve things like housing, healthcare, and schools. Fundamentally kind of means, confronting, the property and the interests, of the ruling class. So it's not a situation, uh, you know, uh, you know, of just, more social work or
Yep.
more police to, terrorize the Black community. That's the answer, but is actually taking hold of the resources that, are available, but currently clutched into the hands of the capitalist rulers of this country.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Bringing us to the last point. Now, we've been talking about the Black question a lot because obviously, huge question, United States. But then this one, we're talking about the woman question. Now, there is obviously this is huge in the US, but in a lot of Western countries right now, I think this debate is really raging. This is on the trans movement. The trans movement is under attack from the right wing across the board. And I think this is also one of the points where you really see the disaster that is sort of the liberal framework for dealing with questions of sexual oppression, identity, and so on. So Kirk, a lot of the videos I ended up watching by Kirk were where he's talking about this, just because this is, I don't know. And, he would just start by saying, okay, let me ask you, what's a woman? And then you'd have, person after person after person just repeat the same old thing, which is a woman is what one identifies as, or something like that, right? And it would just go into a complete mess from there. But how do we deal with the trans question? How do we deal with it from a working class point of view, especially in a period where a lot of the working class, they don't have the patience or the time for dealing with like what they perceive to be like, you have time to discuss your identity. Like, listen, no, things are going the wrong way, right? Like, how do we put forward a working class answer on what is a woman, or a materialist answer rather?
Yeah, well, I mean, in the first instance, it's kind of we unpack kind of what the implications of the arguments that each of those answers is, and then motivate why it's in the interests of basically the trans movement needs to be geared towards changing society. And to that end, the trans movement should look to link itself to the working class, which actually also very much has an interest in changing, kind of fundamental social relations in this society, and is kind of the strongest force for doing so. And on the side of the working class, make the case that it's actually that the attacks on trans rights is kind of the cutting edge of attacks on the rights of the population as a whole, and it is opening the door to a kind of greater attacks and greater repression and regimentation on the part of the state. And in this country, that's not so hard to do. And when the Trump administration, basically every day is launching some new assault on working people in some form or another. But unpacking that debate the answer to the question of kind of what is a woman, I think is kind of important to get a sense both of the implications of both Kirk's definition, but also why the liberals isn't an answer whatsoever. Because the interaction, the exchanges between the two sides kind of I think underscores the problem. So, the liberals responding to Kirk, insisting that, a woman should be strictly defined by biology, by, having XX chromosomes. The liberal response is, well, like you said, if I'm a woman, if I say I'm a woman, I'm a woman. And they try to defend this both in terms of biology and society. Now, in Kirk's case, the saying that a woman is purely a matter of biology. I mean, the obvious problem here is that knowing what reproductive organs someone has doesn't say anything about what it means to be a woman in society at large, which kind of carries expectations for how women are to act and dress and groom, to conduct themselves, the jobs that, they can fill,
And his goal is
things.
to reinforce those.
Yeah, and
Right.
so by insisting that it's simply biology, the conclusion is that those norms, those gender norms, can't be transcended, and trans people should be shunned as pariahs by society, and basically to reinforce the institution of the patriarchal family. The liberals, like as I mentioned, though, they kind of go in the exact opposite direction of Kirk and make being a woman all about
What's in your head.
what's in your head. But this doesn't this can't work either, because and on the biological level, they try to make the case that there's not a sex binary, there's that there's a spectrum, and this just kind of is a way to try to bury the kind of sharp biological differences between men and women, and kind of in the name of it's sex is relative. Clearly, clearly, that's from a standpoint of reproduction, just biology in general. You have two opposite sexes, but variations, and that doesn't. But recognizing there's two opposite sexes doesn't preclude variations between the norms, which do exist biologically. But the problem with the liberal answer, probably the biggest problem, is on the social level, because they claim, they recognize that womanhood is a social construct, which it is, but because they view everything as being a matter of simply what's in people's heads, they kind of leap to the conclusion that because it's a social construct, that it's necessarily kind of subject to the whims of what one thinks at any particular moment in time. But that's just not true. Womanhood is kind of this kind of a deeply ingrained concept, kind of developed over millennia of human history, that is directly tied to major social institutions like the family, that are pillars of kind of the rule of the dominant class in society. And this is not something that can just be switched on and off, or changed into something completely different just because one wills it. So fundamentally, you have to change society in order to be able to break down gender norms. It's not just about changing identities, and that's where one gets to the conclusion that the trans movement, linking its cause to the working class, is the way forward. And like I mentioned, it's then the task to explain to workers that it's very much to their benefit to link their struggles to take up defense of trans people, because as I said, those attacks are just opening the door to wider attacks against everyone, including and importantly the working class.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If I could just add to that, I mean, I think the difficulty is, Erica, as you mentioned earlier, like what's the political agenda behind what Kirk is saying? It's to use this sort of strict biological definition to reinforce a very conservative understanding of what a woman ought to be socially in society, right? Like the whole trad wife concept.
Mm-hmm.
There was even he used to talk about how, I think this is Kirk, but maybe it's some other right winger, but how it should always be the man who pays for dinner and who looks after the woman and the family and so on. It's like this is not just like some innocent debate about biology. It has a real regressive social and political agenda, which is to force women back into the home. But I think on the liberal side, like it really is like they think that if you accept one of the premises that the right wing uses to base its whole reactionary agenda on, if you accept the premise that there is a biological difference, then you are capitulating, and then you are therefore reactionary, and then therefore you are anti-trans. But that's really not the point, because that issue is like, okay, just because you accept that there is a biological difference doesn't mean that we therefore deny that people have the right to transition from one gender to another, right? Like that is a separate question. That is a social debate. And as communists, as we are for people to live how they want. But just acknowledging the, XXXY distinction doesn't make you a reactionary. In fact, I think that's just like, that's dealing with it on the sort of different levels that the question of sexuality and all of these things need to be dealt with. So I feel like that's often the first mistake the trans movement makes. It's like, we can't go anywhere near anything that sounds backwards, because then that makes us bad people. It's everything is in the realm of ideas.
Yeah, and I think that by doing that too, they kind of push women this women into the arms of these kind of reactionary ideas that Kirk is peddling on the woman question, whereas they see have to deal with certain biological realities of dealing with a woman, and here kind of are told by the liberals that these factors have nothing to do with being a woman, and it actually divides what has the potential, but both the interest in being a a very kind of strong movement to push back against the attacks on trans and their very existence. Kirk denied.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, look, the trans movement is under attack in most Western countries at this moment. And I think the point we want to insist on is that, look, we are the most ardent defenders of the rights of trans people. We are for trans people. We're for trans liberation. But the way to go about it, and I really like, Michael, the way you explained it, but also how it's written in the leaflet here, right? Like, this liberal course has been really counterproductive, because it's just the logic of it is divisive. Erica, you just spoke about how it pits like more like cis women, more conservative-minded women against the trans movement. But here, if you've been following along, in Britain we've had this whole new party thing with Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana, and one of the biggest controversies at that movement, which sort of basically imploded a few weeks ago, but they're starting to patch up. Not a few weeks, a couple of days ago, but they're trying to patch up. But you can really see this huge fault line, which is there's this raging debate where how is it? How do I summarize it in a couple of lines? It's like, Zara Sultana came out and said there's no room for socially conservative and backward views in this party. And it's like, okay, well, that sounds nice, but let's just look at this practically. You know what? A lot of the potential members, or the members that this party should try and attract, would be pro-Palestinian elements in society, which we know are largely a lot of the Muslim community. So, you know what? I'm sorry. A lot of Muslims are not woke, right? They're not going to be like, oh yeah, let's go trans liberation. But by putting the question on this footing of like, oh, if you have bad ideas, you get out. But if you're nice liberal ideas, then we can hold hands. So guess what? A green politician, welcome to the party. But if you're a Muslim who questions the whole notion of trans rights, then you get out, right? Like it's so messed up. Like that is no way to actually fight for the oppressed. And I think that just this logic of liberalism on the trans question is really, really divisive. And we're seeing this play out here in like real time, which is a bit trippy. But I really appreciate the way that you guys dealt with this whole question, because it is one of the main ways that the culture wars, especially on campuses, are fueled.
Yeah.
And, I think the left and the liberals, they need to get a grip and really understand that just by recognizing a biological fact, you're not capitulating, you're not reactionary. What you do need to fight for is to actually facilitate materially the rights of trans people to transition. And that's going to come about if you're really fighting against the status quo and the system, not by having debates about what's in people's heads and their ideas. Anyways, that's my rant. Okay, so listen, like I said, I personally, look, since the Kirk fallout happened, I've spoken to a number of workers who've had a hard time dealing with this question on the job when they're talking to their coworkers, because of just how difficult it was to take on Kirk's arguments. It's not very intuitive how to respond to Kirk's arguments outside of a liberal framework. So I really, kudos to you guys for putting this out there. I do feel like this arms us, obviously, but it arms our working class brothers and sisters who want to fight for the working class on the job, in the unions, and so on. So I really appreciate you guys coming to take the time and breaking this all down for us.
Yeah. And I think with the backlash, too, that we're seeing, right now with, Trump's, intents to kind of wage war on the left and increased repression just kind of underscores sort of the, the theme, throughout our kind of response to Kirk and how it's really aimed at the working class, as a whole, all of these attacks with, on the left, on trans, on Black people.
Right. Yeah. Because, the working class is going to be kind of rallied to the defense of Black people, to trans people, not on the basis of moral obligation or embracing every kind of gender expression out there, but because fundamentally it's in their own material interests and defense to do so. And so kind of making that argument in a real way is kind of essential to, countering the reaction that Kirk represented, but also the direction that the liberals and have taken the country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. The last thing I'll say is I just want to go on the record and say that all the left that I've read so far, and that's most of the main sort of groups and tendencies out there, really disappointing in terms of what they've had to say. I think the RCA, for example, I think they've said, okay, well, this has now turned Kirk into a martyr, which, yes, it has. It's not very profound. It doesn't really help us to deal with anything. And, okay, fine. Leon Trotsky said individual terrorism is not our road. Yes, it's not. But really, it's like, here's the reality. Here's what we're dealing with. We need to fight back and really break through these reactionary firewalls that have been put up by individuals like Kirk and Trump and so on and so forth. So I think the left also just totally clueless kind of on what this, what's coming. The White House is coming for us. And I think it's not just going to be restricted to the US. Of course, of course not.
Yeah.
And also just in terms of being able to finally confront some of these really toxic ideas and, take them on head on. And, we don't say we've answered everything, but I will say 1000% actually have answered more than the left ever has. And that's me going on the record. So thank you again. I'll link the leaflet in the show notes. Okay. And as always, you can follow Workers Vanguard on X at Workers Vanguard, as well as on Instagram. Is there anything else you guys wanted to add before we call it a day?
Thanks, Mansa, and check out Workers Vanguard.
Okay, cool.
I think we've kind of spoken to really what's really at stake here and posed here.
Yeah, for sure. Again, thank you guys so much for your time, and hopefully we'll speak to you soon. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.